So, welcome back. This has become a really pleasant habit for me. It kind of reminds me of when I was little, I used to read, or when my kids were little, I used to read to them every night. And I, I made sure to read books that I liked too, that had a good storyline and something I enjoyed and something that might stretch their brains a little bit. I mean, it might not have always been something that they completely understood, but it led to some great conversations. I and yeah, I'd forgotten how much I enjoyed reading out loud. Tonight we're going to do it a little bit differently. We're just going to do summaries of the short stories in Chronicles of Pern, the first fall, and then tomorrow I think we're going to start Dragonseye. And we'll just keep on rolling with this, at least for a while. I mean, I'm having fun, and the person who I started this all for is enjoying it, and that's the biggest thing for me. So we will just keep on rolling with this. I did read you guys the first story in this book, which is The Survey, Pern. The second story in the book is called The Dolphin's Bell, and it's the story, if you remember in Dragon's Dawn, they briefly touched on how Jim Talek was taking his flotilla of ships and trying to get some more of the equipment up to the north and gets hit by a hurricane. And that's what the story in The Dolphin's Bell is, and it delves a little more deeply into the relationship between the dolphins, who were also colonists of Pern, and the humans, who were their partners, and just the way they worked together. And without the dolphins, they would not have made it to the north because they actually ended up towing a lot of the boats. The the flotilla that Jim escorts up to the north is completely an ill-assorted grouping of boats. I mean, he has a couple of big sailboats, but mostly what they're sailing is canoes and dinghies and barges and things that really aren't good for an ocean crossing. And, this being Anne McCaffrey, she's really good at throwing at least a tiny bit of romance into most of her books. So Jim Talek actually ends up partnered by the end of the story with Theodora Force, who is a dolphineer, and they end up together at the end of it. And that is pretty much all that happens in The Dolphin's Bell. It's a nice little story, and the name The Dolphin's Bell is because they have a bell at the end of the pier in the south that the dolphins, it has a rope that the dolphins can actually come up and ring the bell when they need to alert humans that there's a storm coming or that there's something along those lines. It also introduces, which later on in the series, Anne McCaffrey actually wrote a book called The Dolphins of Pern, which picks up the saga of how the dolphins fared much, much later in the series. And the dolphins, they consider it their duty and their honor to save humans, to tell them where the fish are running, to escort the ships to and fro, to warn people when there's going to be a storm. And that kind of, it gets passed on through each dolphin generation, that is their sacred duty. And so it's a nice little story. The next one in the book is The Ford of Red Hanrahan, and it picks up 9 years after Dragon's Dawn stops. And by that time, the dragons there's about 500 of them. So from our original 17, there's now 500. So the queens definitely were fertile. And the Dragonriders they've moved up into the crater of the old volcano that's above Fort Hold, and made it nice and livable. And by this time, the colonists have continued procreating, and so it's becoming imperative that they kind of spread out away from Fort Hold, which is what they named that first area up in the north. And so initially they made a place called Southern Bowl, which was named after Emily. After, unfortunately, she died, there was a fever that went through all of the Fort Hold because it was so overcrowded, and killed off a lot of people. And that's another reason that they want to spread out, is, to limit things like disease that can go decimate an area. So the next hold that gets established is established by Red Hanrahan, and that's what the second story is about. And during this story, they find out that if a queen dragon goes into season, they call it rising to mate, because what she'll do is they go down and it's called blooding their kill. They just suck a couple of cows or whatever they can catch dry of blood, which gives them quick energy, and then they fly as high as they can, and whichever bronze or brown can catch them ends up mating with them. And they find out in this story that a queen will not share her bronzes. And if one rises to mate and another one is close to rising, it will put her into season 2, and there's a terrible, terrible fight between a couple of queens. So they learn a hard lesson. One of them ends up to the point where she won't be able to even fly anymore. But we also see a little bit of Sean and Sorka's oldest child, because Sorka has, I think, 6 by this point. And he evidently is quite crazy for dragons. And so, yeah, in this second story, it's just how Red gets a group together and they find a place and make it livable with the help of the dragons, and they end up naming it Ruatha, which means, what does it mean? Hold on. The hold of Red's Ford, in the old language, Ruatha. Ruatha. So, that is the second one. It just sort of expands a little bit what is happening there at the beginning of the colonies. The third one takes place, probably about another 8 or 10 years, because in the second or in the third story, um, Sean and Sorka's son is now a dragon rider. He impressed a bronze at the youngest age that his father would allow him to stand as a candidate on the hatching grounds, which was 12, which is just a little bit young in my mind, but you know. Um, and it picks up with Sorka and Sean and a rider whose name is Tureen, who has a really interesting ability. If you remember, Sorka in the very beginning could hear most of the other dragons, but as each dragon and each rider learned to communicate with each other, she stopped really being able to do that. Well, Tureen can hear every single dragon. And it's her story about how she's been going to a place over on the east coast of the northern continent. And, you know, they've been looking at it and just sort of dreaming of expanding and making a new ware, which is what they call it. There's holds, and then there's dragon wares. So they're just dreaming about it, but not thinking that it is ever going to happen. And a little later on, Sean makes the announcement that he is not just going to let them start up one new ware, because now there's, you know, well over 500 dragons. They're going to make 4. So they're going to make one on what they call Big Island, which becomes Ista ware. And then they make one off in the mountains, which is near Telger Hold. Big surprise there. Telger made himself a hold over where he said that he was going to explore and make a mining area. So they make a ware there, and no big surprise here either. They name it Telger Ware. So there's Ista, Fort Ware, and then the one on the east coast, which they end up naming Bendon, and there's a hold that's attached to it, which also becomes Bendon, named after Admiral Bendon, who at this point has passed on as well. And Sean sets the precedent that pretty much stays, which is whichever queen is the oldest or senior, which actually, I guess in this short story, he just says whichever queen rises to mate first will become the senior queen of each of these new wares, and whichever bronze catches her, that rider will become the ware leader. So, and it also, this story lets you know, later on in the books, most of the dragon riders, the men, all have names which are short. And you find out why, because evidently, as the dragons are fighting Thread, they shorten all of their riders' names. They basically elide them. So, Mahal, which is how Michael Connell becomes known, he becomes M apostrophe Hall, Mahal. Someone with the name like Peter would just become Peter. And that actually ends up becoming established firmly by the time that the modern books come along. In fact, women who have children in the ware sort of name their kids with a mind to, will it contract into a decent name? But yeah, Tureen is the rider at Bendon Ware, and her queen rises to mate and gets flown by Sean and Sorka's son, Mahal's bronze, and they become the were leaders of Bend and Ware. And then the final story is a really interesting one. It's called Rescue Run, and it's takes place about 55 or 60 years after the colonists first landed on Pern. And it's the story about the spaceship, the Amherst. And on board the Amherst is actually one of Paul Benden's probably great nephews. And they're doing a swing of the outer space, the far reaches, because evidently the Nathi have come back and are causing more problems, and it looks like there's going to be another war. So they're just sort of prowling around in the far reaches of space, and they come across the fact that the Rukabot system, where Pern is located, has an orange flag, which means anybody who's in the area should check it out because there's something wrong. So they go and they check it out, and during this, they actually do a dissection of the thread capsules and discover exactly what they are. They're a spacefaring species that it might actually have had some sort of intelligence up in the Oort cloud, but by the time it gets dragged into Pern's atmosphere, all that's left is just a mindless shell that then, as it gets heated up and friction comes through, or it goes through the atmosphere and friction wears away its outer case, becomes thread. So they find out a little bit about that, which is to them quite interesting because they're not on the planet. And they investigate because there's, the Mayday that was signed by Ted Tuberman, which it didn't get forwarded to the Federated Sentient Planets colonization arm because it wasn't signed by either Paul Benden or Emily Bull. So they just slapped a little orange flag on the system and said, we don't know why this was launched, but, if anybody is ever in the neighborhood, go check it out. So they go down and they go to check out the colony of record, which would be where landing is. And as they're spiraling down, they notice one little heat blip up in the northern continent, which is locked into deep winter at this point. But they're not scanning caves or anything, so they don't think to even look up there. They go down to where landing is, and they see nothing but ash, because at this point Mount Garvin has still been erupting periodically, and most of landing is under about 15 to 20 meters of ash. But they do get a blip, like a homing signal. So they go and they find, believe it or not, Stev Kimmer, who ended up finding Kenjo's homestake. And this part's kind of gross. He marries Kenjo's, he gets with Kenjo's widow. And if you remember, she had 3 sons and a daughter with Kenjo. And then he has, I believe, 3 daughters with Kenjo's widow. And then, after Kenjo's widow dies, he also ends up, it's heavily implied that he has some more kids with Kenjo's sister, who he has raised as his own, supposedly. Stev Kimmer was always sort of a ew. Anyway, they find Kenjo. the people from the Amherst, and his little family, which consists of Kenjo's 3 sons, daughter, a few more, 3 more daughters that that Stev Kimmer had, and a couple more kids whose parentage just isn't really said. It's either poor kids are the obviously going to be the result of inbreeding somehow. And Stev manages to convince them that this is all that's left. He tells them all about Thread and how it's just ended. Like it's been maybe five years since the last Thread fall, and he convinces them that they're gonna have to take them back to some sort of reasonable society, which they can't figure out how to do because the added weight of these 11 colonists that, need rescuing are going to make it to the point where they might not make it back to their spaceship because they need fuel. And Kenjo's oldest son, Jiro, actually knew where Kenjo kept the fuel. So they were able to top it off. And there's a lot of things like the colonists being told that they can't bring their fire lizards, which but they do end up bringing what's called numbweed, which becomes a very important thing in the books as they go on, which is an indigenous plant that, when it's boiled down, basically just becomes an anesthetic cream. And they bring that along, and they also bring along Stev Kimmer convinces everyone but Kenjo's 3 oldest kids that they're going to be robbed. So he has them basically gold plate anything that they can get their hands on in the shuttle. They wear gold plated clothes, and they almost end up killing everybody because they overload the shuttle so much that they almost end up in the sun. They end up using far too much fuel, and it's one of those edge of your seat type things as they finally make it back to the Amherst, their ship. And then we find out why no one ever comes back to Pern again, because they slap an interdict on the system saying this system is terrible, nobody should ever live here. They do establish that Thread is going to fall on the planet every 250 years. It will last for 50 to 55 years every time it comes around. And yeah, they basically label the planet Pern as not fit for human habitation and take off, never to come back. And that's pretty much the short stories. I hope that made any sort of sense. And I'll read you the back of this one, and then we will start it tomorrow night. And hopefully it's also enjoyable. So this is Dragonseye by Anne McCaffrey. It was actually written in... What year was it written in? It was one of the more modern ones, written not too long before she died. It was written in 1997. And I will read you the back, and then we'll start it tomorrow. It's been 200 years since the deadly thread fell like rain upon Pern, devouring everything in its path. No one alive remembers that first horrific onslaught, and no one really believes in its return except for the Dragonriders. For 2 centuries, they've been practicing and training, passing down from generation to generation the formidable thread fighting techniques. Now the ominous signs are appearing, the violent winter storms and volcanic eruptions that are said to herald the approach of the Red Star and its lethal spawn. But one stubborn Lord Holder, Lord Chalkin of Britta, yes, they did name a hold after Avril, refuses to believe, and that disbelief could spell disaster. So as the Dragonriders desperately train to face a terrifying enemy, they and the other Lord Holders must find a way to deal with Chulkin before history repeats itself and unleashes its virulence on all of Pern. So we will start this tomorrow, and hopefully you guys had a good day. I had a really cold day. I think this has been our coldest day so far. I think our high today was 23, which is why I am like in massive bum gear. Got my 2 pairs of pants on, I think 3 shirts. It's cold. Even the swans didn't come by today. I think they probably stayed over where the water stays open out by the spring. So, anyway, I will see you guys tomorrow. I hope you had a great day. And, yeah, tomorrow we'll start Dragonseye.